I love villains. Villains are the best. How do you write a villain? Well, first and foremost, let's define what a villain is and what a villain is not. A villain is a character whose motives are, villainous. It's typically a character that can be seen as archetypically evil, or a character who is framed in sort of moral opposition to your main character. But usually they're kind of like general evil here. It's kind of a little bit of a vague term, but that's what a villain is. And what a villain is not is the antagonist. It's not the same thing as an antagonist. An antagonist is a character that opposes the main character on a plot-driven scale, and they're not necessarily evil. A villain can be an antagonist, and often is the antagonist. However, it's not always the case, because antagonists don't have to be evil. Villains don't need to antagonize the protagonist. Basically, a villain is more of an archetype rather than a necessary plot thing. I'll talk about antagonists another time, though, because defining these would be a good idea. But let's talk a little bit about villains. When I think about villains, there are two kinds that kind of come to mind. There's like the ultimate evil villain, and then there's a more sympathetic villain. Both of these characters represent a value antithetical to the ones of our heroes, but they serve the plot in different ways. The ultimate evil is more or less a representation of evil itself. There's no nuance to it, and that's not a bad thing. I find people really are against the ultimate evil, but usually that's because of a lot of other compounding issues rather than this type of villain itself. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with giant monsters that are purely evil. There's nothing wrong with bad, evil, dark lord type villains and all of that ilk. There's a reason that they exist in fiction. I'm someone with a tendency towards sympathetic villains, but I rarely find myself able to escape the need for a bit of a unsympathetic evil touch. And that sounds dirty. But in fantasy and other speculative works, it's kind of hard to avoid it a little bit. Usually unsympathetic forces make for great like end battles, because it allows your hero to defeat the very concept of loneliness, death, hatred, whatever this thing represents. I think Ursula's going to talk a bit about this tomorrow. But it can be done without the haze that comes with defeating a sympathetic villain, the less shades of gray. It makes it more impactful, more epic and cool and spirit lifting, whereas gray type endings kind of leave you on a bit of a dour note, because, you know, conquering something that isn't quite ultimately evil comes with some baggage to it too, because it makes your main character not ultimately good, so it leaves more of a bittersweet taste. Okay, well, not always the case. These sort of villains are sort of endgame. They're like I said, there's triumph, there's excitement to it. But on their own, and this is the main issue, these villains can run the risk of becoming very boring, because the shades of gray create a lot of nuance and a lot of interest, even if they can't be as powerful in the more positive light, I guess. That's where sympathetic villains come in. Sympathetic villains are wonderful ways to strengthen the argument against this ultimate evil. It's more conversation-like rather than just punching things, okay? Like I said before in my subplot video, villains have often walked the path the same as the hero and end up choosing the wrong path at the end. Looking at it from this framework can help you make your villain character more relatable, understandable, and relevant to your plot. Your villain is the hero of their own story, and this is the most important thing to remember when writing a sympathetic villain. and even an ultimate evil villain, honestly, but sympathetic villain more so. Whether they love to be villainous or hate it, they believe that their actions are justified. A sympathetic villain has submitted to their flaw. The urge that makes you cheer for your hero's success is what will make your villain's fall cut deep because of this. The hero learns to triumph against their flaw while the villain begins to cave under its pressure. It boils down to sort of like a character who is naturally lonely, who learns to bring friends into their life, and then with the power of friendship they defeat Lonely Heart. Is that freaking Care Bears? I think that's Care Bears. No Heart is Care Bears. Oh my god, do you guys remember watching that stuff? I do. Why am I talking about Care Bears? Oh my god, why do I go on these freaking tangents? Freaking Dora the Explorer and Care Bears are my go-to freaking examples. How can we even take anything I say seriously at this point? Anyways, yeah, so as the villain learns to triumph against their thing, the villain caves under its pressure. Or they don't. Because the villain isn't necessarily the antagonist, villainous characters can also be right. Your character could live in a cruel world where evil is the correct option. And in this case, just because your character stands in opposition to the villain doesn't mean they're right. Villains of both varieties can take on the role of a mentor in this way, pushing the character towards an unhappy truth. The only example I can think of this right now, and I know there's a lot more, is The Dark Knight. I know this was explained to me, but the Joker isn't so much the antagonist character in that as he is more of a companion type character. He pushes Batman towards accepting his role as the Dark Knight rather than being an antagonist, which is more the case for Harvey Dent, who continually gets in the way of Batman's retirement plans. I have not seen that movie in a while. I hope you like my take on it. I don't think it's my take. I've heard this explained to me. I forget where. But the Joker is like unambiguously evil and villainous. So you can sort of see how that works. Villainy isn't about what the character does for the plot. It's about a character archetype. It's about the values that they hold. And you need to be able to like pull these apart, because your antagonist doesn't have to be villainous. Your villain doesn't have to be antagonistic. Even though antagonize kind of implies the villainy, and you can probably say that the Joker antagonizes Batman in that movie, he doesn't act as antagonist in a strictly plot sense. Villainy is on a spectrum. There's like purposes for both the hyper-sympathetic villains and the absolute evil villains. You don't want to shy away from either type just because you think that a sympathetic villain isn't powerful enough, or because you think that ultimate evil villains are boring. You need the full scope of villainy, guys. You gotta be like evil on all accounts. And you don't necessarily need a villain either, but if you're gonna add one, you need to think about what the different types of villainy add to your story and balance it out accordingly. I think what I'm mainly trying to say in all of this is just to pay attention to what you're doing, as usual. Just balance your sympathetic elements, balance your ultimate evil elements, and have fun being evil. You know? Just punch a baby. Okay, that's a great way to end this. I've changed our store from Store Envy to Ticktail. So yeah, because a lot of silly stuff came up, and now we're changing to a different store. Better do it now than later when I regret it. Yeah. Thank you so much for watching. If you are evil, click subscribe, and we'll take over the world. The evil value I represent is pride and greed, and I want subscribers and money. So do it up for me. Yeah. Care Bears, guys.